So like I said, we're going to get almost done with the PowerPoint. Good thing is today it's a little bit of PowerPoint. It's actually mainly videos. I've got 3 separate videos that we're going to watch. They're all very much related to what we're doing, very informative. I think they're all well done. Just take some good notes, add on to your notebook, and you'll be in good shape. As far as things coming up, if you haven't done the Columbus document analysis yet, that was due last night before 11:59 or by 11:59. If you can get in to meet today, it is only 1 day late, 20 points off, ain't that bad. Plus, it's super easy. On Friday, this whole PowerPoint, all these videos, all these notes we've been taking, that is in preparation, amongst other things, for the SAQ that we're going to do on Friday. It is my plan, since we've only done a few of these, and it's been a while. It's my plan tomorrow after we finish up the PowerPoint, we will spend some time reviewing expectations for the SAQ, going over exactly how you'll be graded, going over exactly what you need to do. If all works out the way I have planned, pretty much all we will do on Friday is the SAQ. You only have like 14 minutes to get this thing done. So that's 14 minutes of obligation you have to fill on Friday. My hope is that for those of you that owe me things, you can use the remainder of class to hopefully get at least some of that in. Again, a lot of it depends on how you use your time. When we have time to get caught up, I mean, if you utilize your time effectively, you can get caught up. If you sit there and jack around on your cell phone, that's kind of on you. You got to be responsible. You got to make good decisions. I can only do so much to try to help you out, so just keep that in mind. Lastly, Monday, all this notebook stuff that's listed out up there. That is going to be due before midnight on Monday. I was originally going to do it on Friday, but I figured with the SAQ and all the late work and whatnot, we would just push that on to Monday to give you the weekend to get caught up if you need to. More story is you can still do a lot to dramatically improve your grade, even if you haven't turned in much. So take advantage of those things. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and get started. I got a stopping point in mind, so if we finish early, we finish early. I don't think we will, but you never can. So picking up where we left off yesterday, we talked about the Spanish. We went back to the Spanish and Portuguese in the New World. Portugal had a lot of interest in the Old World as well, but those are the first 2 European countries to come and really settle in the New World and take over vast swaths of territory. Now, after the initial conquest of the Aztec and the Inca and some other groups, the Spanish were doing all right, but they weren't doing as great as they would. It's really not until a little bit later that the Spanish strike it rich. But unlike, the gold, the God, and the glory, it ain't gold they found, it was silver. A whole bunch. 2 big silver mines you need to know, Spanish silver mines. You've got Zacatecas in Mexico. Remember, if I write it on the board, it is worth writing down yourself. And even bigger, Potosi. There's a little advertisement up there for that. Potosi in what is today Peru, up in the Andes Mountains. Spanish silver, Zacatecas, Potosi. Guys, they start pulling so much silver out these mountains, these mines, that just like that, Spain goes from, having a lot of land but not a lot of money to being the absolutely richest empire on earth. Did not last in the long term, but silver gets so abundant that it becomes a unit of exchange that just about everybody on earth is willing to accept. It becomes a almost universalized currency. Heck, the Chinese for a while, they didn't have a whole lot of silver on their own. They convert from paper currency over to silver currency. That's what they want. They had so much coming in just because trade had become globalized. Now, eventually, inflation gets out of control, and it's one of the things that kind of leads to the Spanish having some struggles. But that silver, I can't really overstate just how important silver circulating throughout the global economy helped to connect everything that much more. Now, while the Spanish were getting wealthy off of silver, the Portuguese were getting wealthy off of cash crops. Okay, they were growing tobacco, just like, we talked about in Jamestown, but even before that. But their big cash crop, the biggest one, the most valuable one, was sugarcane. All right, so follow the trail here with me. Sugarcane. It's not indigenous to Europe. I forget if that word is indigenous to Europe. It's maybe Southeast Asia. It's taken years and years and years to travel to Europe, but it's a crop that requires a tropical climate to grow it. So the Europeans could never really grow it on their own. All of a sudden, the Portuguese have a lot of territory in the New World. What big territory did we say the Portuguese controlled? They had some areas in the Bahamas. What's that? They had some territory. You're not wrong. But there's that really huge country. South America. Brazil. All right. They had Brazil. A lot of that's rainforest. But along the coastline, they could clear a lot of that foliage and the trees out, and they could harvest and plant sugarcane. The problem is this sort of work is very, very difficult, especially in a tropical environment. Now, originally, the Portuguese, much like the Spanish, enslaved Native Americans. But a lot of them died. A lot of them ran off into the rainforest, and they couldn't find them. So Portugal hatches a plan, a very evil plan. Remember, it is the Portuguese that were the first to explore and travel all the way around Africa. The Portuguese already had trading posts along the coastline of Africa and business relationships with some of the African kingdoms there. It is their need for cheap labor and some evil racist mentalities that leads to the Portuguese starting to import enslaved persons from Africa to go work in their plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, primarily because of sugar. So sugar, not directly, but yeah, pretty much is really the reason that you see the transatlantic slave trade start. It starts with the Portuguese, then later, the Spanish adopted, then later those North American colonies ran by the English and the French and the Dutch adopted as well. And that is the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And that is a legacy that will carry on for years and years, even after these colonies win independence and become countries of their own. We're going to spend most of the period talking about the evils of the transatlantic slave trade. But before that, kind of as a little review, a video I'd intended on us watching yesterday, but it just didn't work out. We were going to watch a little crash course over the Spanish Empire. This is a good review, okay, because they'll talk a little bit about the conquest of the Aztec and the Inca. They'll talk a little bit about the importance of silver to the global economy. They'll talk a little bit about a lot of the things that we've talked about and give you some additional information that we did not get to.
Hi, I'm John Green.
You do not have to take notes because Crash Course, the guy speaks really fast, and I could slow it down, but we don't got time for that. I'd much rather you just pay attention. All right, if you pay attention and combine that with what we're talking about and the notes I'm asking you to take, you're going to have everything you need to be successful in this class. So pay attention, don't fall asleep, don't get on your phone, don't do anything else. Let's see how and why Spain becomes such a powerful force in world history at this time.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about the entire fracking globe over the course of several centuries. So let's get right to it. Mr. Green, fracking? You don't know about Battlestar Galactica yet, Niece in the past? Oh man, there are so many great things in your future. Today I'm going to try to show you how tiny Spain's influence spread around the world and shaped the lives of almost every human on the planet, generally in negative ways. I know, everything is such a bummer on Crash Course recently. It's the 16th century. People are getting richer, they're living more connected lives, and all I can do is whine about how much better the old days were. What am I, your grandpa? Let's get vested. Woo! So the Aztecs weren't the first impressive polity in Mesoamerica. That honor would go to the Olmecs or the Mayans, but they were probably the greatest. The Aztecs formed out of an alliance of three major cities in modern-day Mexico in about 1430, just 89 years before Cortez and his conquistadors showed up. The Aztec state was very hierarchical, with an emperor at the top and a group of unruly nobles beneath him, just like Europe. And in addition, there was a class of powerful priests whose job it was to keep order in the cosmos. So Aztec religion held that history was cyclical and punctuated by terrible disasters, and then would ultimately end with a massive apocalypse. And the job of the priest was to avoid these disasters by appeasing the gods, generally through human sacrifice. The Aztecs extended their control over most of southern Mexico, parts of Guatemala, and the Yucatan, and they demanded tribute from conquered people in the goods, precious metals, and people to sacrifice. If you're familiar with the Hunger Games, it won't surprise you to learn that this didn't sit very well with said conquered people. And the fact that the Aztecs were basically ruling over thousands of people who hated them made it a lot easier for Cortez to come in and find allies to overthrow them. All that noted, in less than 100 years, the Aztecs accomplished some amazing things, especially the building of their capital city, Tenochtitlan, on the site of modern-day Mexico City, which was like Venice in that it was divided and serviced by canals. They also had floating gardens called chinampas, which provided food to the city. Oh, it's already time for the open letter? All right. An open letter to human sacrifice. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, nice. Come on, be a mushroom, be a mushroom, be a... Oh, no! Dear human sacrifice, look, I'm not going to defend you. But if you really believe that the world is going to end, if the gods are not appeased, then human sacrifice kind of makes sense. And as evidence for this, let me submit to you that we engage in human sacrifice all the time. Remember the movie The Dirty Dozen? No? Because you're too young? That makes me hate myself. Anyway, it's all about glorious sacrifice, and now sometimes a few have to die in order for many to live. Did you at least see that Meteor movie that Ben Affleck was in? What was that called, Stan?
Asteroid.
Asteroid.
Armageddon.
Armageddon. Armageddon. Right, like that. Human sacrifice. Best wishes, John Green. All right, now let's head south to the Inca civilization, which was older than the Aztecs and in some ways even more impressive. Founded in the 13th century, the Inca Empire ruled between 4 and 6 million people by the time the Spanish showed up in 1532. Trade and a very effective administrative structure held the empire together, which was even more impressive when you consider all the roads and that were built atop mountains with nothing to haul things up those mountains except for llamas and people. The Inca had no written language, but they were able to keep records with knotted strings called quipus, and they were really good at integrating conquered people into the empire, mandating that people learn the Incan language, and finally they ordered every male peasant under Inca unpaid work for the Inca government for a specified period of time each year. This system, which the Inca called Mita, allowed them to build all those roads and temples. The Spanish would later adopt this system and the hierarchical system with the emperor at the top, except they would make it all, much suckier. And yes, that is a technical historian term. So the Spanish arrived in Mexico in 1519 and in Peru in 1532, benefiting in both cases from total chaos due to disease. And after conquering the Inca and the Aztecs, they created an empire with 2 administrative divisions. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, founded in 1521, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, founded in 1542. In some ways, the Aztec and Inca empires were perfect for Spanish conquest. Their administrative structures were similar. There was a similar link between secular and religious power, albeit different religions, all of which made it relatively easy for the Spanish crown to step into the void left by those 2 great empires and send their own administrators to run the place. While most of the Spanish aristocrats who came over ran large agricultural operations, you don't see a lot of movies called like Indiana Jones and the Search for a Nice Farm in the Countryside. The real glory for conquistadors was gold. Initially, they found some both in the Caribbean and in Mexico, but never enough to get like super rich. Fortunately, or as I will argue, unfortunately, they did find a mountain made of silver. So the Spanish adopted the Mita, which the Incas had used to build roads and public buildings, to mine and process that silver. So 1/7 of the adult male Indian population from each district was required to work in the silver mines for a year, being paid only subsistence wages. Now you might wonder why the Spanish didn't purchase African slaves to work in the mines. They did in Mexico, but in South America it was cheaper to use indigenous labor. Purchasing slaves was inefficient because 1, they didn't have experience working at high altitudes, and 2, mine work was super deadly. Mercury, which can be used to refine silver ore, was found at the mountain of Huancavelica, and mercury poisoning among miners was so common that parents would often maim their children to keep them from having to work in the mines.
You can see why I'm struggling to be festive. Let's go to the thought bubble.
Mines in the Americas produced over 150,000 tons of silver between the 16th and the 18th centuries, over 80% of the world's supply. Spain became the richest nation in Europe, and Spanish silver pesos became the de facto currency. But the Spanish royal family does not appear to have understood inflation, and the huge influx of silver caused skyrocketing inflation, and since they never set tax rates to account for it, they collected the the same amount of money 60 years after the discovery of silver, but that money was worth a fraction of what it once had been. And in general, it's not clear that Spain benefited much from the discovery of silver. Rich countries have a way of finding their way into expensive and not totally necessary wars, and Spain was no exception. While empire wasn't the central cause of Spain's many 16th century wars, it sure did fund them. So in 1519, which was a heck of a year for Spain, Charles V united the kingdoms of Spain and Austria by being named head of the Holy Roman Empire, so called because it was not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. Charles had this dream of a unified Central Europe, which was constantly being thwarted by German nobles who had a dream of a non-unified Central Europe, and eventually Charles V's ambitions were shattered, and he gave the Austrian half of his kingdom to his son Ferdinand, and gave Spain, the American stuff, to Philip in 1556. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Philip II didn't only inherit all of Spain's holdings in the Americas and in Europe and in the Philip, not a coincidence, he also inherited a rebellion in the Netherlands because the Dutch were like, we're going to be Protestant. Also, you guys know nothing about economics, which incidentally the Dutch are still saying to the Spanish. And then the English sided with the Dutch, and there was a war featuring a disastrous invasion of England called the Spanish Armada in 1588. England's success against the Spanish, even though it can largely be chalked up to weather, was credited to Queen Elizabeth I. That led to a period of wealth and national pride, which meant that people had both the money and the desire to see, I don't know, plays about old English kings named Richard. And that, my friends, is how the discovery of silver in Bolivia contributed to the genius of William Shakespeare. Anyway, American silver didn't cause these wars any more than it wrote Hamlet, but the new wealth made both more possible. Knowing that they had this enormous silver war chest at their disposal made them much more inclined to build all those ships that got sunk in 1588. And soon enough, even a mountain of silver couldn't pay for all their warring, and the Spanish crown had to borrow money, which they couldn't pay back, so they defaulted on their debt several times in the 17th century. Yay, silver! So most of the silver mined in the Americas went to Europe, but at least a third of it went to China, either directly on Spanish galleons or indirectly through the purchase of Chinese goods. China had encountered inflation of its own after printing the world's first paper money in the 12th century, so they switched back to coins. Initially, Chinese coins were made out of copper or bronze, but their economy was so big, they were the leading producer of consumer goods until the 19th century, that they ran out. So they went to silver. Now, China didn't have a lot of silver itself, but Japan did, so they traded manufactured goods for it, but soon even that wasn't enough. This was mostly because in the 16th century, China changed its tax structure. Taxes, man, they're at the center of human history. In the early part of the Ming Dynasty, Chinese farmers paid their taxes in goods, mainly grain and labor. But as more silver entered the economy, the Ming government changed its policy and required taxes to be paid in silver. This meant that almost everyone in China had to produce something that could be sold for silver, which usually meant silk. In fact, the Ming government often required people to make silk. That glut of silk inevitably led to a price drop, which hurt the Chinese economy, but not nearly as much as it hurt the Spanish economy, where almost every silk producer was put out of business. So much for the idea that global outsourcing is a new problem. You'd think that all this silver would make the Chinese incredibly rich, just like the Spanish. Yes, just like the Spanish, in that they got rich, but they didn't stay rich. The Ming government also failed to pay taxes to inflation and spent too much on defense, notably the Great Wall. And by the 17th century, the Ming were overthrown by the Fu Manchus. Oh, it's just the Manchus? Gah! History only. As the historian Dennis Flynn put it, a significant hunk of the GDP of China, then the world's biggest economy, was surrendered in order to secure a white metal that was produced mostly in Spanish America and Japan. Think about what else those resources could have been used for. The Spanish Empire silver trade was the first truly global market. Even India was involved, but we're really out of time. And its consequences were dire, even if it did make some people rich. Both Spain and China experienced inflation that weakened their governments. The environment suffered. The search for precious metals led the Spanish to find and eventually destroy two of the world's great empires, the Aztecs and the Inca, and many thousands were killed mining silver and the mercury used to refine it. But before you say it wasn't worth it, remember that this process led to the life that you have today, one where I can teach you history through the magic of the internet. Worth the sacrifices, human and otherwise? I don't know, you tell me. Thanks for watching.
That's okay. Again, you know, silver, it changes everything. It helps connect all these different empires, all these different regions, but nothing lasts forever. Now on to the really gruesome, messed up, evil stuff. We kind of segued there. It starts with the Portuguese and their greedy desire to have, you know, forced labor working on their plantations. But it expands soon to include a lot of other people as well. So let's talk about the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. We are now starting part 4 of the PowerPoint. Remember, you do need to have at least some notes over each part. So you look at the causes. First, greed. You know, the Portuguese, later the Spanish, later a lot of these other Europeans in the New World. I mean, they were here to make money. Remember, under mercantilism, colonies are to be exploited. That's the goal. You want to stockpile as much gold and silver as you can, as much wealth as you can. And ultimately, you know, that greed and some true racist ideas. I mean, Europeans at least stated, at least presented to the world, that they were culturally and biologically and racially superior to everybody else. And if they can believe that themselves, if they can espouse that belief, they can then justify doing horrible things to non-white individuals elsewhere in the world, such as in the Americas, such as in Africa. So the Portuguese, you know, they initially enslaved Native Americans. Native Americans die and escape. They had contacts in Africa already. Remember, the Portuguese know Africa better than really any of your European nations at this point, because they're the only people that have been all the way around it. So the Portuguese start trading. They start forming contacts with some of the kingdoms along the African coast. They negotiate with them, and those kingdoms basically would raid neighboring kingdoms and abduct individuals to sell to the Portuguese as slaves. That's the beginning of this transatlantic slave trade that will last from the 1500s all the way into the 1800s. Really, really terrible. You know, certainly one of the greatest sins in all of history. Now, the transatlantic slave trade has another name, and it connects to something else we've talked about. And it's a strange name that you don't hear very much, but the College Board loves stuff like that. They love to throw out terms that people haven't heard of very much. This is sometimes called the African diaspora. We've used the term diaspora before. First, with the Jews being forced out of, you know, their homeland of what is now Israel. Later on, we talked about diasporic communities like Muslims living in Indonesia. Diaspora just means a mass disbursement, you know, spreading of something. Very similar to diffusion. Well, this is the African diaspora, because you have large numbers of Africans, enslaved persons, being forced into migrating primarily to the New World. Yeah, this leads us to our second video. We've got 3 today. Don't worry, the next 2 are not as long as the first, and I think that they're a lot better personally. Crash course, you know, very informative, but sometimes can be a little bit annoying. I get that.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course.
This video gives a really good breakdown of the transatlantic slave trade. Talks all about, you know, some of the causes and obviously the effects, not only in the New World, but also on the populations left behind in Africa. Again, this is all part of the legacy of the Columbian Exchange. It's all connected. And it is, like I said, one of the great evils in human history. So pay attention. We'll talk about it first.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy: the Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. Natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
All these different historical events have ripple effects. I mean, you look at, some of the racism that's persisted throughout a lot of our history. You look at some of the problems that have occurred in Africa since, all the way back then. I mean, even after slavery or the importation of new enslaved Africans is made illegal, the Europeans weren't done with Africa. In the late 1800s, Europeans go in and take over all of Africa and colonize it for many years. It's evil. It's evil. And that is one of the legacies of this time period. Europeans, really building their empires overseas, using imperialism, using colonialism, using slavery, enriching themselves and putting themselves in power to do this over and over again for the next several centuries. It's hard to get an exact number. It really is. But you're looking at somewhere over this, 300-year period almost, between 10 and 20 million Africans enslaved and brought to colonies in the New World. When we're looking at, the different parts of Africa that were affected, almost all of Africa was affected to some extent. But as far as the transatlantic slave trade is concerned, you're mainly talking about the groups living in Western Africa. Like a big source of slave labor was the Kingdom of Congo, this region, kind of towards the southwestern part of Africa. Now, keep in mind, this isn't the only massive slave trade going on. We had earlier talked about the Indian Ocean slave trade out of Eastern Africa, really facilitated by Arab Muslims. That's still going on at this time as well. But now the Europeans, at least the Portuguese, have access to the East Coast as well. And it's just, it's astonishing. It's amazing just how much devastation was wrought. Now, when you look at numbers, look at where most of the enslaved persons are going, right? You do have some coming up to North America. You do. In our country, the United States takes part in the slave trade well after they win their independence, as do most of these other places. But your majority of enslaved peoples are going to the Caribbean, they're going to Brazil, they're going to South America. Again, because that's where a lot of the sugarcane plantations were. That's where a lot of the cash crops could be grown, like coffee, like cotton, like tobacco. Some of that stuff you could get up here as well, but there was more of a need in the colonizers' minds in this area of the world. And this goes on literally for hundreds of years. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean was terrible. It's got a certain name, almost a nickname. Has anybody ever heard of it? Yes, go ahead. Anybody ever heard about that journey across the Atlantic? You know this name because it gets referred to a lot. Somewhere between 10-20% of enslaved Africans never make it to the other side. This journey is called, it's going to drive me nuts if I do this in red and everything else black. So let me get my black behind. The Middle Passage. And you may recall hearing about this at some point. I want you to just imagine, you got to use your imagination here. You, your family, your friends, abducted from your homes. You're shaved, you're branded, you're forced onto these ships. And guys, you're packed in not like human beings, you're packed in like cargo. Because to the European traders, that's what you are. You are not human. You're in some way inferior to them. You almost have to believe that to do that to another human being. So they would pack these enslaved persons, into the cargo holds of ships. Guys, you know how long it took to get across the Atlantic back then?
Like years?
It didn't take years, but you're talking, depending on where we're looking at, on average, 6 to 8 weeks. And again, they're going to different destinations, and you got to think time of the year, you got to think the weather. There's all sorts of factors that play a part in this. But 6 to 8 weeks living in those conditions. Now we're going to watch one more video, and it gets into a lot of the same information, but I think it's important you understand what it was like for these people on these ships. I know there was a document I read once where somebody was kind of observing, what your standard enslaved African had to deal with, and as far as how tightly they were packed in, they said a man would have more room in a coffin than where these people would be for hours on end every day. Chained together, stuffed into areas with low roofs, because again, it's areas primarily made for cargo. If you had to use the bathroom, you're using it on yourself. I mean, you're talking about people getting sick, you're talking about people dying, you're talking about people going insane. To do that to other human beings is about the most evil thing that I can imagine. And then after that 6 to 8 week hellish journey is over, you go to a life of backbreaking labor and abuse in the New World. Again, that's the legacy of the transatlantic slave trades. Like I said, one of the more evil acts in human history. A lot of people were involved. This final video, and it does repeat some of the stuff from the last one, but I think this gives you a better picture of exactly what this experience would have been like. Deals with the life aboard a slave ship. And then we've got just a little bit more, and we'll call it a day.
From about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly transported across the Atlantic, a journey that approximately 2 million of them would not survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of enslaved people per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, enslaved people were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions, and had their heads forcibly shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, enslaved people lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch those enslaved who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unchained in their designated compartments, and children often free to move about the ship. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind. Enslaved people were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged the enslaved and crew members alike. The enslaved people generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender, with a barricado, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Enslaved people were also subject to forced exercise, which sometimes included dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Enslaved captives deemed disobedient were tortured and beaten, usually with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Enslaved people who refused to eat their typical meal with rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with a speculum oris, a medieval tool used to force open a person's mouth. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World, carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left present-day Ghana in August of 1781 with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 enslaved people and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Enslaved people that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but the enslaved who drowned were. Collingwood ordered approximately 130 enslaved people thrown overboard. He claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat enslaved people the same. The court agreed with the ship's owners. but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong, and its story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted, meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any ship transporting enslaved people across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the international slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England an additional 26 years, and the U.S. another 58 years, plus a civil war, before the practice of slavery was officially abolished.
Like I said, evil. And when they said slavery was outlawed, that was the slave trade. The slaves that were already within these regions, I mean, that was legal for many, many years afterwards. And as we know here in the United States, even after the end of slavery, you have years and years of persecution and oppression and political policy designed to treat, African Americans as second-class citizens. The last thing that we're going to do, we're going to stop on this slide because we're only got like maybe 2 more slides over the slave trade. You need to be familiar with this particular system. Okay, and the Middle Passage was a big part of it. It was called triangular trade. And this is the economic backbone of colonialism and mercantilism. From Europe, you got manufactured goods. Because again, they had gotten to a point of wealth and technology that they had more than a lot of other places. They would take these manufactured goods along the African coast and they would trade them for enslaved Africans. Those enslaved Africans that would have to endure that terrible journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, where they faced a life of servitude and just pure hell. A lot of times these enslaved persons were procuring raw materials. They were harvesting, cash crops like sugar, tobacco, cotton. One of the byproducts of harvesting sugar and processing it is molasses, which you can make rum out of. Those raw materials would then be transported back to Europe, to the European mother country. The whole process would repeat itself over and over again. Again, this is how those original European nations evolved. We're talking about Spain, we're talking about Portugal, England, France. The Dutch, for at least a little while, really gained a foundation for a lot of their wealth. And it's one of the reasons a lot of those countries were able to become dominant world powers in the years to come. Tomorrow, we're going to do just a little bit left on this, look at some numbers. There's a few terms and names you're going to want to get down. Then we got just a little bit in our last part of the PowerPoint. That's more some of the ramifications of all this in the old world. What changed in the Indian Ocean? What changed in Afro-Eurasia? We'll get into that a little bit at the end. And then hopefully we'll have some time to just kind of review some basics about writing SAQs. If not, we can do that before we do the SAQ on Friday. Then on Friday, of course, we will have your SAQ over all this stuff, terms, names, good stuff to use. But then whatever time is left, you can use to hopefully get caught up if you are missing anything, because all these things I will not accept after 4:20. Other than that, we got about 5 minutes. Y'all hang loose. And we'll pick up where we left off tomorrow.